is a perfect example of someone who went through many different paths to find exactly what she was looking for. And much the same questions are probably in a lot of your heads about what am I going to do with your degree? What am I going to, where to next? What thought process should I have? And instead of me going into the details of what she's done, LeAndra had a great idea of just taking you all through the journey herself. So I won't waste your time trying to introduce her, because half of her talk is going to be introducing herself and her career pathway. But LeAndra is the senior director of Ecova Incorporated, and we're very lucky to have her. She's a geology major from Pomona College, so I'll let you take the floor.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. So thank you, Todd, for having me here. And actually, I think we made the introduction through Russell. So I met Russell this past summer. And so I just want to thank you for inviting me to come here and talk about this story. I feel very fortunate to be here and talk to you all. I was a little bit worried that my talk wasn't going to be highly technical, so I had to make up for it with my dorky title, which you'll see here, but also to hopefully to get you guys interested in what I mean by a sexy career. By no means am I trying to dissuade anyone from their current degree, or if you are a geology major, dissuade you from becoming a geologist. This is really about my journey and how it can apply to other people's journeys in terms of doing something that you really love from something that you really love. I loved geology, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, but I also love what I do now. And so hopefully you'll get a couple of tidbits in terms of how this journey can turn into something that you love doing. I'm not sure why it's doing that. We practiced it before. Okay.
You have to click on it. That's it.
I'm just going to check to make sure it's doing what it's supposed to do. Okay, there we go. All right. So I'll start with the beginning. I grew up in a very small town in northern New Mexico called Taos, New Mexico. And for all intents and purposes, Taos is ripe with geology. It is the tail end of the Rocky Mountains. There is a huge rift there. There's lots of tectonics going on there, so it is just absolutely a haven for geology. Unfortunately, I had a very crazy mother who, from at a very young age, never wanted me to get dirty. So I spent very little time outdoors while all of my other friends and even other family members were going camping and what have you. I didn't do any of that. So I sort of entered into the world not really having this appreciation of the outdoors or geology. There were lots of other crazy things about my mother in Taos. So I did what most rebellious teenagers do, and that is that I left. And so here's a timeline of how I got from there to here. And I'll go into some of these details as I progress in the conversation here, but I think the important takeaways here are that there was a big journey for me. There were lots of steps along the way. Some of it involved geology, some of it did not involve geology. And it was really a hard decision for me to sort of figure out what I wanted to do with my life and what I wanted to be when I grew up. At the end of the day, I knew that there was something that I loved about geology, but what did that mean for me? So let me talk about the things I loved about geology before I sort of talk about why I decided not to be a geologist. I think the thing that I loved most about geology was being outside. Like I told you, when I grew up, I didn't spend a lot of time outdoors. So my first geology field trip, it was a paleontology field trip, and I absolutely fell in love with being outside. And this is going to sound so nerdy, but I absolutely fell in love with getting dirty. And once I went on field trips where we were camping, I loved that whole aspect. What I loved even more is when I finally took my first mineralogy class, and I looked at a thin section under a microscope, and at a very granular level could look at the chemical makeup of that thin section and be able to speculate what had created an entire mountain range. That just like blew my mind, and that is another thing that I loved about geology. I loved the camaraderie. I loved all of my fellow geology majors. We'd spend lots of time together in the department together. We obviously spent lots of time together on field trips. I loved being so tactical. I loved being able to see these things and realize them in real life. I loved realizing that there was so much that happened so many millions and millions of years ago that brought us to where we are today, and I felt so insignificant compared to all of that. So this is what I loved about geology. So why didn't I want to become a geologist? So as Todd mentioned, I graduated with my degree from Pomona College, and for all intents and purposes, I was full-on geology major. So I started my major late, which meant that I had to double up on classes, double up on labs, and that meant a lot of homework and a lot of lab work. I did research while I was in school. I also did research 2 summers. So for 2 summers, I did the Keck Symposium, and I got published from doing that research. 1 summer, I did geology field camp out in Wyoming because Pomona didn't have a field geology class. And so, I mean, you would think that with all of these things I loved about geology and with all this stuff that I was doing around geology, why did I want to be a geologist? Well, I didn't want to be a professor, and I didn't want to do research. I didn't want to go into oil, so like all the typical careers that you would think about in becoming a geologist. And that left me with a big question about like, what the heck am I going to do with my life? I don't know what to do and what career I want to have. And unfortunately, or maybe fortunately for most, Pomona really set up geology majors to go to graduate school, to become a PhD, to become a professor. And so I felt very helpless. I didn't know what to do. And I can tell you, back to my timeline, I spent a lot of time being lost. There was another thing that sort of led me to this quandary. I realized I didn't like school. I really didn't like studying. I really didn't like taking tests. I didn't like spending hours in the lab, or only certain labs I enjoyed spending time in. And so I knew I wasn't cut out for the academic piece. And then lastly, I can tell you with honesty, I really lacked a motivation to apply to graduate school. When I thought about the application process, when I thought about taking the placement exams, it just completely overwhelmed me, and I knew that I just didn't want to go through that whole process. So, not knowing what to do, I got probably one of the best jobs a geologist can get, and that is becoming a park ranger in Yellowstone National Park. And it was amazing, I have to tell you. I was 28, so that gives you a little indication of not only my age, but also it took me a little while to sort of get my life together. So I was 28 and I was a park ranger, and you have very little responsibilities. You're not making a ton of money, but the benefits are you're like living in this amazing place. There's like a whole employee pub for you to go to drink beer with all of your friends and colleagues afterwards. And more importantly, you get to talk about geology in this like heaven of geology. So it was absolutely worthwhile. But there was a couple of things that didn't sort of stick with me as to like, why didn't I make this a career? So at that time with the National Park Service, it was a seasonal gig. It's changed a little bit now, but it was a seasonal gig. And so most people spend their summer working in one park and their winter working in another park. And so there's that instability. That was a factor for me, but the other factor for me, and again, I'm just going to be completely honest with you guys, is I really don't like talking to people as much as I had to talk to people when I was a park ranger. So for example, in Yellowstone, the busiest time, you're talking to 1,000 people a day. And you get the same questions, like you just want to talk about geology and be all jazzed about that, and you're getting questions like, what time does Old Faithful go off? Is that really the correct time up there? Where can I see an elk? Where can I see a bear? And so those kinds of questions, this just wasn't the career for me. But what I took away from this job were 2 very important things that stick with me today. And that is being able to communicate with people and being able to talk in front of people and do public speaking. So after a park ranger, I spent 2.5 months living out of a car, backpacking across the US. And then I felt really lost. So there was more journeys along the way, there were some heartbreaks. I really tried to like have some self-discovery during this time. And I was I finally ended up in Los Angeles with my brother, where he said I could live rent-free, which was really good because I think I had like $300 to my name. So I went to Los Angeles, and I dyed my hair magenta, and I decided to look for my first real job, which actually didn't turn out too bad. So my first real job was with a company called ICF. Now, mind you, I had just come off being a park ranger and living out of a car for 2.5 months, and my hair was magenta. I didn't own a business suit. I frankly didn't even know how to interview for a job. The way I heard about the job was from a fellow Pomona alum. And I went into this job interview. It was a 6-hour interview, and I felt completely unqualified for the job. Looking back, there were definitely indications that I was qualified. So what were some of those indications? Well, first, let's just the science of it. So you recall from my timeline, I don't know if you can recall, but I did do a stint with the USGS. And when I was with the USGS, I was basically studying carbon sequestration, so looking at carbon storage and modeling greenhouse gases. And the job that I was applying for at ICF was basically a job modeling greenhouse gas emissions for EPA. And basically what EPA wanted to know is if you take greenhouse gases from certain sources and turn it into energy, how cost effective is that? So Todd was actually asking me before the talk called, do you have any programming skills? And at the time, I literally knew the basics of Excel. I knew nothing about programming. So I think I sold them, maybe on the magenta hair, I'm not sure, but I think I sold them probably on the skills that I'm going to share with you in a little bit, which I think probably all of you have those skills. In fact, I know all of you have those skills. So I sold them on this, and I actually ended up getting the job, but I can tell you that my first few months, I felt completely unqualified, and I spent days and nights teaching myself how to program in different languages, but also in Excel, because that was a big part of the job. And it was a lot of determination, but it ended up being one of the best decisions and best jobs I've ever had in my life. I got incredible mentors out of this job. I learned how to, so it's a consulting job, which means it's kind of like a lawyer job, right? Time is money. You have clients, you're billing to clients. I learned how to be so much more focused and so much more attentive to getting work done by far more than I ever did in college. I mean, I used to procrastinate like crazy in college, writing papers or studying for exams. I'd go to the library and I'd probably spend like at least an hour like walking around and seeing who else was there and talking to them before I ever got to the studying part. So the skills that I got from this first consulting job were just completely invaluable, and I am just so thankful that a fellow alum opened this door for me. And I have to say one thing. I was living in LA at the time. And is anybody from Los Angeles or spent much time in Los Angeles? Okay, so my impression, and it could have been that like most of my friends were in the entertainment industry, so a lot of times I was hanging out and going to social gatherings with people in the entertainment industry, and going to parties with people in the entertainment industry, and like I remember people used to ask me what I was doing, and I would say I'm modeling greenhouse gas emissions, and they were like, what does that mean? And on my timeline, I had the most glamorous job ever. The reason I say that is because the sources that I was modeling greenhouse gas emissions from was human sewage and landfills. So that was a real treat to tell people in the entertainment industry that my job was modeling human sewage and determining what people ate and then how much methane you get from that. So I alluded to this a little bit earlier, and what I'm going to share with you is that, I told you I spent a big part of that ICF first job feeling completely inadequate and unqualified for that job. And looking back all these years later, I realized a couple of things, that I did have the tools, and you all have the tools. Because as science people, as policy people, as environmental people, we have a couple of traits that really serve us very well for a number of different jobs, and that is that we're analytical. We can take really complicated concepts and communicate them to people. We are quantitative, and we are thinkers, and we are problem solvers. And so if you take those skills, you can apply those skills to so many different options, not just academics. So I realize that now. In addition to that, come on in. Hi. So in addition to that, there are a couple of other key takeaways that have really impacted not only my life, or not only my career, but also my life, and that is the role of mentors. I cannot tell you how important it is to have mentors. And this is not somebody who is going to pat you on the shoulder when you have a bad day, or you had a bad test, or an interaction with a colleague or another student or a professor. This is somebody who is going to take you out of your comfort zone and push you to do things that you're not comfortable with. And these people don't have to be, people that are, significantly older than you. It can be your classmates. It can be anybody that you can talk to that is going to be blunt with you and is going to give you constructive criticism, because that's how you grow. You don't grow by just hearing everything that you do right. You grow from hearing things that you need to improve upon as well. The second thing that I would say is take your time. So I got my first real job when I was 29. And for most of my friends, that was really, really late in life. But I really enjoyed that journey. Even though it had bumps along the way, I really did enjoy that journey. And especially looking back, I'm so glad I had that journey, because you don't have to grow up so fast. You don't have to create this whole future for yourself right away. You can take some time to really examine what you like doing, what you don't like doing, what you think you want to do, what you don't want to do. And sometimes it really helps to sort of when you're trying to make plans to go out to eat, and it's sometimes it's helpful to sort of say, well, I don't feel like Mexican and I don't feel like Italian. Okay, well then that leaves some other options. And so that's one really helpful thing about taking the extra time. The third thing I would say, and this applies to any career, is making networks. So I can say from that ICF job, the conferences that I went to, or the meetings that I had with people, or the mentors that I had, became this huge network for me. And I can tell you that every job that I've gotten since then has been because of that network. I've been able to call people, take them out for coffee, take them out for lunch, do informational interviews, but just sort of have doors opened because you have people who know you, who recognize you, and who hopefully can help you. And the last thing is, there are so many options out there, and I chose to go this consulting route. I also worked for a utility company, always in energy efficiency and renewable energy. But these are not the only options. And also, Todd, at the beginning of the talk, or before the talk, was mentioning to me that there's this sort of perception that in order to go out into these other fields, either you need to have all of those computer programming skills, or you need to be an engineer. And again, you don't need to have all of those. I mean, those certainly are options, but you don't need to have all of those capabilities. So that brings me to now. So this is the company that I work for now, Ecova. They're headquartered out of Portland, Oregon. They are a consulting company. They're also owned by a company called NG. It's the world's largest energy company. They're a very cool company. They do a ton of green and renewable in Europe, but they've also started acquiring a bunch of other companies here in the United States on energy storage, electric vehicle charging stations. I thought I was being really fancy. I went to Paris recently, and they're headquartered in Paris, and so I was going to go visit them, and I thought I don't speak a lick of French at all. I thought I was being super classy and cool by calling it Angie, and people were like, no, really, it's just NG. So stop trying to put your little French twist on there. But so how did I get to Ecova from all that other stuff? So ICF, after I stopped modeling human sewage and landfills, had an opening in energy efficiency, their new energy efficiency department. And so, because I was already with that company, that provided an opportunity. And the first job that I had in energy efficiency was, I'm not sure that you all will remember this, but does anybody know what a CFL is? Okay, a CFL was sort of like the market's first very efficient light bulb that you would plug in. It was supposed to last 7 years, and reduce a whole bunch of energy. And at the time, like Walmart, Target, Sears, all of the stores that we go to buy light bulbs didn't even have these on their shelves. And so my job was to basically go and talk to retailers and tell them about these energy efficient bulbs and get them on the shelves. And then I did a lot of other things after that. You know, I worked at PG&E, and at PG&E, I worked on some of the regulatory stuff. Are people familiar with the California utilities and how that works? Because a question that I get a lot is like, why do utilities want to do energy efficiency? Doesn't it sort of go against what you would think utilities want to do?
No, not at all. Because it's waste on their end. They want to sell as much electricity as they can.
No. Well, if they made money doing it, they would, but it's actually not how they make money. So they're regulated, and they make money a couple of different ways. They make money on their assets that they own. They also make money on achieving certain energy efficiency goals. So meaning reducing electricity and reducing gas.
I've heard that consumers subsidize industry. Is that where you're getting from?
They do.
Okay.
Yeah. So if you have a bill from PG&E or any of the other California investor-owned utilities, yeah, we put a little bit of money into a pool, and that pool of money then gets back to customers in the form of rebates for energy efficiency primarily.
Oh, okay.
And so it's actually much less expensive for utilities to do this than it is for them to build additional capacity. So that's one of the reasons they do this. They're also regulated to do this. One of the last jobs that I had at PG&E was, so most utility companies, I didn't know this until I worked in the utility industry, most utility companies, if you're a very large commercial customer, you actually have a designated person at the utility that's supposed to help you with all of your energy needs. But if you're a small business owner, like a dry cleaner or a deli or a flower shop, you don't have this. Yet you're probably really struggling with your bottom line and managing your energy costs. And so PG&E had some phone reps who basically helped these kinds of customers, and I worked with those phone reps. The interesting thing is, does anybody remember when San Bruno down in the Bay Area happened, when the gas pipeline blew up?
Yeah.
So when that happened, obviously it was very sudden, and PG&E didn't have a way to deal with really escalated calls. And as you can imagine, right, this happened. And now everybody is like calling PG&E and saying, is this going to happen to me? My child, I have a child at a preschool daycare, you know, right next to a gas pipeline. How can you guarantee that that gas pipeline isn't? I mean, it was like massive chaos, not to mention that you had like an entire neighborhood that was completely blown up. And so the really interesting thing is the very last job that I had at PG&E was all of those phone reps that I just talked about that were dealing with the small customers. They actually were transferred to work with all of these San Bruno calls. So it was just like in you know, one of those life experiences of like humanity. It was just a really incredible experience. But in any case, so now I'm at Ecova, and what I do at Ecova is back to commercial customers. Those commercial customers are just super busy, worried about their bottom line. They also tend to not pay attention or understand their energy costs at all. And so one of the things that my team does is we basically create solutions for commercial customers. So what does that mean? That means something very simple like putting a smart thermostat in their facility, and then putting an electric management system in so that you can control the equipment when you're off-site. It means coming up with sustainability plans for them. It means helping them understand their energy costs more. And so it's really a way of just really meeting the needs of that niche market. And so that's what I do at Ecova now. And before Ecova, the job that I had before was a little more theoretical, looking at the whole grid and smart grid. And I'm not going to go into all of the details of that, but it was a job that really sort of helped me understand where the utility industry is going, and we can, if there are questions about that, we can talk about that, but I won't go into the details. But essentially, there's just, in the utility industry, there are big, big changes coming because there's lots of things that are impacting the grid, and that's things like solar energy, energy storage, electric vehicles that are just like changing the supply and demand of electricity all over the place. And so if I had sort of any advice about like where the future of jobs are in this market, I mean, obviously there are a lot of different options, but certainly looking at the grid and where the grid is going and how that impacts utilities and what customers are doing on site, there are certainly a lot of opportunities there. And so with that, I'll end. And thank you again for having me and allowing me to be here, and I'm happy to engage in some questions.
Russell.
Thanks, man. Actually, that was kind of a cool talk. I like the pace of it. I have two questions. Well, I'll do one because they're good in different directions. Even though there weren't a lot of hands, we do have quite a number of students that become environmental science majors because of the energy resource. And I've always thought, well, I always think of energy people as being engineers, they're going to get into physics and stuff, but obviously you've seen another side and you go through geology.
Yeah.
So what's your comments to those students who come into college thinking, I know energy is a big issue for California, what can I do by not being a physicist and be involved?
Yeah. Did everybody hear the question? What can I do with my degree if I want to get into the energy world, but I don't want to be a physicist or engineer? Is that the gist of it? Yeah, it's a really good question, and I'm obviously not an expert in this, but I can give you a couple of ideas that I have. So first, I would say on the policy side is huge, especially in California, but also in other states like Illinois and New York and Massachusetts, where the utilities are regulated, because that regulation means that there is just tons of legislation and tons of policy that are framing all of this. And so there are definitely options on the policy side. The second thing is, and I kind of dabble in this, which you wouldn't really think, but it's really what I call sales. And so as a consulting company, you are selling your skills and your services and your expertise and all that quantitative analytical problem solving stuff I told you. You're selling that to a utility company. And so there are certainly opportunities to do that sort of sales piece, and that doesn't mean that you have to have had sales experience. What it means is that you're able to sort of think analytically for a utility, help them problem solve, think strategically, big picture kind of stuff, so there's certainly that option. The second option is that there's just like what I call implementation stuff. So, there's lots of companies who are actually doing the implementation of all of this stuff. So there are solar companies, there are, distribution companies of the energy efficient products, there are, the smart thermostat folks. So there's just lots of different options in terms of actually being the feet on the street, either working directly with the consumers or working on the retail or manufacturing side. So that's another option. And then a last one that I can think of is, you'd be surprised, within a utility, there are a number of different options within a utility. I mean, there are just a lot of jobs that you can seek out in a utility that are any of those things that I just described, or also doing research and development. So I would not discount looking at utilities as well. Yep.
When you came right out of college, your first job was with the Forest Service. Did you take the GIT or the Geology and Training exam, or is that even? And would you recommend that? Is what I'm getting.
So no, I did not have to take it. So I worked for the National Park Service. It actually wasn't my first job. My first job was. Anyway, but specifically for the National Park Service and to be the type of park ranger that I was, which was called interpretation, which is basically we're doing all the education kind of stuff, you did not need to take that exam. Yeah.
You talked about it a little bit, but a part of this class works on resume building, and you talked a little bit about the types of skills that people have but they forget they have them in order to either let employers know that you can do these kinds of things. So you mentioned problem solving skills. What other terms come to mind to help students build up their resumes that's going to get people's attention as opposed to just, I can do Excel, I can do Word, I can do PowerPoint, whatever. What are the key words that you think, that if you were hiring, that you'd want to hear, that aren't just necessarily skill-based, but, go beyond?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I spent a lot of time thinking about resumes, so I'll picture a couple of different ways. So the words, I actually don't like it when I see resumes that say I know how to do Excel or that sort of thing. It's like, okay, well, anybody can say that they do Excel, right? And I more like sort of like hearing about the capabilities that go along with that. So I like hearing about analytical skills that include. I like hearing about problem solving that, an example may be. I think other things are highlighting communication skills or any involvement, like any civic involvement, any involvement that shows that you're out there, especially if it pertains to the topic of the job, because that really shows that you were dedicated to this, and this is something that is very important to you. And I like sort of seeing those in bullets at the front of the resume before you sort of go into all of your previous work experience. I think sort of having 3 to 5 highlighted bullets at the top that sort of highlight these skills really stand out, and it's probably something that they look at on the resume immediately. And because you probably haven't had a ton of jobs, also coursework, I would say, that pertains to the job is also a really good thing to put in those bullets. Yeah.
What about for California, the growth of the marijuana industry, particularly the indoor stuff? Because I just was in Sonoma and looking at an environmental impact report, and the amount of energy that this one production facility, that's major revisions, I think, to that local grid.
Yeah.
Are you starting to ramp up for this and prepare for this as a consultant?
Yeah.
What do you see for the future of that impact on the grid?
It's a really good question. So I'm not personally involved in that, but like what I know from the industry is that you're absolutely spot on. Like it's a huge issue, and so I think a lot of companies like my company are really trying to address it from a couple of different ways. So like definitely for any kind of indoor growing, the amount of lighting and water that's necessary is just huge, and so there's a lot of R&D going around sort of like the lighting technology that can reduce the energy use on that. And I think the other thing that people are really looking at is, a lot of times it happens in very specific areas, which may be, less grid constrained or more grid constrained, and so it definitely depends in terms of like where geographically you're looking at it. But I don't have a ton of experience with it. I know that like the lighting is a really big deal and the water.
So along the lines of Todd's question, for students looking to graduate or graduating now, other than coursework, what other skills other than Excel and GIS, right? Because everybody needs that.
Sure.
What other skills do you see as being important in kind of the new industry? Specifically, say, the electric utility industry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I would say one thing is getting involved in organizations. And going to those conferences, and there are a lot of times really great scholarships for these organizations. So one organization that I'm really involved in is called Association of Energy Services Professionals, and we have 3 conferences a year. The content is everything from energy efficiency to sort of behavioral, what's happening, like, and how do you adjust people's behavior to be more conservation focused, to renewable energy. And for those 3 conferences, we always offer scholarships, and so it's a really good thing to get involved in for a number of reasons. One is the content, but also, again, going to that network building and just showing that you have some involvement with an organization, I think, is really helpful. And a lot of these industry organizations also have local chapter involvement, so you don't have to go, you don't have to spend a lot of money traveling. There's also like local things that you can do as well. So I would say that's a really important thing to do.
What are some examples of the organizations you're talking about, like professional organizations?
Yeah, so it depends on what you're interested in. So that's definitely one. If you're more sort of policy focused and research focused, and you sort of want to be on the more academic side, I would say ACEEE.org is another example. I actually think that like following, I'm going to sidebar here for a second. Sure. There are two industry, they're not like organizations, and the word is escaping me. But anyway, they're called Utility Dive and Green Tech Media. And they are just two resources for incredible amounts of information and innovation and what's happening in the industry. And they have weekly newsletters, so it's really interesting to sign up for their newsletters because you can choose what you're going to read or not read. But I have to say, like, I am addicted to these two sources. They're just like two sources of really, really great information. Yep.
What was the other organization besides Utility that you mentioned?
Green Tech Media.
Green Tech.
Can you repeat the first one? What did you say? What?
Utility
Dive? Thanks.
That's DYE.
DIVE.
Oh, Dive.
Just as a note, we'll probably link these, Bill, to the website. So.
You got it.
Okay, we got it. All right.
And then some of the, let's say, who would be Ecova's competitor? What are similar consulting firms, specifically in California, that you know of?
Yeah. So Ecova, actually, their biggest money maker is that they and this is like this office is in Spokane, Washington. They, for like all of the large companies that you can think of, MacDonald, Safeway, whatever, they pay their utility bills, not just like energy, but their water bills. And so they basically manage all of their utility bills. So what the Portland office does is, I think, more what you're asking, which is this more consulting kind of stuff. So there's several, and I've probably worked at all of them. So one is called Nexent. That was my previous job. Another one, ICF, is definitely a competitor. Another competitor is called Clear Result. And so once you get into this industry, you'll realize just how incredibly incestuous it is. So good and bad. The really good thing I will tell you is that for lots of these companies that are not headquartered in California, they want you to sign a non-compete, which means you can't go work at a competitor. But non-competes are not legal in California, so we're not held to any of those if we actually sign the deal in California, which is a really good thing. Yeah, but they're all great companies. They're all doing slightly their own thing. They do overlap in certain areas. And I didn't leave my contact information, but I can write it. And I'm happy to talk to people offline if they have questions, or I don't know if you guys are on LinkedIn, if you want to connect with me on LinkedIn and sort of see my network and the companies that I've worked for and the organizations that I'm involved in, but I'm certainly happy to talk offline as well. One of the big things that I do is mentoring, so I'm happy to talk to people about that as well.
One thing that I hear from students is the interest in sequestration, CO2 sequestration. So based on what you've done, it was many years ago, are you keeping up on any of that? Okay.
No, not really. Yeah. Not very much.
Yeah. But do carbon caps, whether any of that, or cap and trade stuff, does that ever come into energy efficiency?
It does. It's not something that I'm involved in, but absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, because I mean there is just such a direct link between energy savings and carbon and carbon footprint and the savings that come with that. And there are some utilities. I mean, there aren't a ton of utilities, but they definitely like looking at when they're sort of like designing energy saving programs. They like looking at the carbon savings as well.
Did you have your contact info in one of your?
No, but I can write it down.
I know. I don't have the. You don't have.
Okay, well I'll just spell it for you if you want to take it. So it's L and then my last name, MacDonald, M-A-C Donald, at Ecova, ECOVA.com.
Great. Then I think I want to thank LeAndra for an excellent talk.